A Muslim diplomat traveling through Russia in 922 AD witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ahmed ibn Fadlan watched as Viking raiders performed intimate rituals with a slave girl before burning her alive with their dead chieftain. His detailed account reads like the script of a horror movie, except every word was real. What you're about to discover comes from documented historical sources that reveal how Vikings used sexuality as a weapon of war, a tool of social control, and a pathway to the afterlife. These practices shaped medieval Europe and influenced concepts of power that persist today. The evidence is so disturbing that many historians initially dismissed it as enemy propaganda. From public wedding consummations witnessed by entire families to sexual executions performed as entertainment. From rape as systematic psychological warfare to intimate funeral rites involving human sacrifice, Viking sexual practices were calculated methods of maintaining dominance that would make modern audiences physically ill. The evidence comes from the sagas, archaeological findings, and eyewitness accounts that reveal a society where violence and pleasure were inseparably linked. In Viking society, your sexual role determined whether you lived as a respected citizen or died as a social outcast. Power and dominance governed all intimate relations with the subtlety of a battle axe. The Vikings had two crucial concepts that could literally get you killed, and rager. These terms described men who were sexually passive or feminine. Being called vager was such a devastating insult that Viking law explicitly stated it justified murder. You could kill someone for suggesting you were sexually submissive and walk away without facing any legal consequences. This created a sexual hierarchy more rigid than a medieval caste system. The active partner, the beauty of this system from a Viking perspective was that you could destroy someone's masculinity without actually having to engage in the act yourself. But Vikings often went beyond symbolism. Defeated enemies, especially leaders and warriors, faced systematic sexual assault, designed to transfer masculinity from victim to victor. The Saga of the Volungs describes how captured kings were subjected to public rape to demonstrate their complete defeat. According to Viking beliefs, forcing someone into the passive role literally stole their masculine essence and added it to your own. The psychological impact was devastating and intentional. A sexually violated man couldn't return to his community with honor intact. His own people would often reject him because he had been marked as unmanly. Some victims committed suicide rather than live with the shame. Others became outcasts, wandering between communities as living reminders of Viking dominance. Vikings practiced sexual enslavement on an industrial scale. The slave markets of Dublin and York were filled with captives destined for intimate use. The sagas matter-of-factly describe how raiders divided human beings like livestock, with the most attractive reserved for leaders' personal collections. The Yokni saga mentions Earl Sigur keeping a harem of captured Irish women, treating them as interchangeable objects for his pleasure. Viking laws created a two-tier system that would make a parade look progressive. Free women had extensive protection against sexual assault, but captives had no rights whatsoever. Any free man could use a slave sexually, and killing a slave for resistance barely qualified as a misdemeanor. The legal code of medieval Iceland states that raping a free woman carried the death penalty, while raping a slave woman resulted in a fine equivalent to damaging someone's property. The scale of this system was sent. These sheets were often preserved as legal documents that could be presented in court if the marriage was ever disputed. In some cases, trusted family members actually remained in the room during consummation to provide eyewitness testimony. The saga of Grettir the Strong describes a wedding where the bride's uncle stayed in the room to ensure the marriage was properly completed. Can you imagine your Uncle Mike watching you have sex with your wife? The legal implications were serious. If the bride wasn't a virgin, her family could be sued for fraud. If the groom couldn't perform, the bride's family could demand compensation for damaged goods. The Icelandic law codes specify exact penalties for various sexual failures during the wedding night, creating a legal framework that treated intimacy like a commercial transaction. These practices focused entirely on property, inheritance, and political alliances. The bride and groom's feelings were irrelevant compared to the legal and financial implications of their sexual performance. Love was a luxury that Viking society couldn't afford when there were dowies and bloodlines at stake. Ahmed ibn Fadlan's eyewitness account reads like the most disturbing anthropological study ever written. His description of Viking funeral rituals was so shocking that historians spent centuries trying to prove he was lying. Unfortunately for our faith in humanity, archaeological evidence has confirmed most of his observations. When a Viking chieftain died, the funeral became a multi-day orgy designed to transfer life force from the living to ensure the chief's power in the afterlife. Vikings believed that sexual energy could be transferred through intimate contact and channeled to the dead. Ibn Fadlan describes the selection process with clinical detail. The Vikings asked the dead chief's slave girls, "Which one of you will die with him?" 1 WDW. Viking society created a paradox that would confuse modern feminists and traditionalists equally. Free Viking women enjoyed rights that wouldn't appear elsewhere in Europe for centuries, while enslaved women faced treatment that would shock medieval torture specialists. Free Viking women could divorce their husbands for sexual inadequacy with the ease of returning a defective product. If a man couldn't satisfy his wife, perform poorly in bed, or was considered unmanly in his approach, she could legally leave him and take her property. Women could inherit land, run businesses, and propose marriage to men they desired. The saga of the people of Laxar Dal describes Un the deep-minded who controlled vast territories and arranged marriages for her male relatives. Some women became wealthy merchants, controlling trade routes and commanding their own ships. The sagas document women who divorced husbands for wearing clothing that was too feminine or failing to defend their honor properly. Halgur, in Niall's saga, left her husband because he wore a shirt that showed too much chest, considering this unmanly and grounds for divorce. Viking women had legal protection against unwanted advances. Laws clearly stated that unwelcome kissing or intercourse carried heavy punishment, including exile or death. For free women, consent mattered in ways that wouldn't be seen elsewhere in medieval Europe. But this attitude had a dark side that reveals the true nature of Viking society. These rights only applied to free Viking women. Enslaved women had no rights whatsoever and could be used sexually by any free man with no legal recourse. The same legal code that protected free women's sexual autonomy explicitly stated that slaves were property to be used as their owners saw fit. The contrast was intentional and brutal. By giving free women unprecedented rights, Viking society reinforced that freedom was precious and slavery was ultimate degradation. A free woman's ability to refuse intimate advances made an enslaved woman's inability to do so even more pronounced. Viking women actively participated in their society's violence. Archaeological evidence from sites like Birka suggests some women were warriors, and the sagas describe women who encouraged their male relatives to commit acts of sexual violence against enemies. They understood that their own freedom depended on maintaining the system that enslaved others. While Viking women gained significant rights in adulthood, baby girls were often abandoned or killed if families couldn't afford to raise them. The sagas casually mentioned fathers exposing unwanted daughters, leaving them outside to die from cold or wild animals. This created a society where a small number of free women held significant power, while the majority of women faced lives of brutal exploitation. Viking attitudes toward same-sex relationships created a sexual hierarchy so complex it required legal scholars to navigate. Homosexuality was perfectly acceptable, provided you followed the rules about who could penetrate whom. The sagas describe warriors who traveled across Europe seeking sexual conquests of both genders. The saga of Eric the Red mentions men who kept both wives and male lovers, treating sexual dominance as a form of collecting trophies. As long as they maintained their active role, this behavior was not only accepted, but celebrated. Even the gods faced sexual politics. Loki was constantly mocked for taking female form and bearing children, including giving birth to Odin's eight-legged horse, Sleipnir. Odin himself was criticized for practicing seidr, a form of magic associated with women. The Prosite describes how other gods questioned Odin's masculinity because he engaged in practices considered feminine. The practice of Side reveals how gender and sexuality intersected in Viking culture. Men who practiced this magic were often considered urgy, sexually deviant, because they were taking on women's roles, but they were also feared and respected for their supernatural power, creating a paradox where the most powerful men were also the most sexually suspect. Viking law reflected these complex attitudes with typical Nordic precision. While no specific prohibitions against homosexuality existed, severe penalties applied for accusing someone of being sexually passive. The legal codes show that sexual insults were taken more seriously than many violent crimes, with false accusations of sexual passivity carrying penalties equivalent to murder. Men showing any feminine traits, whether in dress, behavior, or sexual practices, risked complete social destruction. The pressure to maintain masculine dominance was so intense that it shaped every aspect of Viking society. From clothing choices to career paths to religious practices, Vikings turned sexual violence into public entertainment with the enthusiasm of modern reality TV producers. Justice focused on spectacle as much as punishment, creating a legal system that doubled as sadistic theater. Criminals convicted of sexual offenses faced punishments designed to humiliate them in the same way they had humiliated their victims. Rapists might face public sexual assault as part of their execution, with the crowd cheering as justice was served through ironic violence. Adulterers could be castrated before audiences who treated the proceedings like a sporting event. These punishments served multiple purposes beyond simple justice. They reinforced social hierarchies through sexual humiliation while providing entertainment for the masses. The public nature sent clear messages about power distribution, while giving Vikings an excuse to indulge their taste for creative violence. The sagas described festivals where sexual violence was part of the scheduled entertainment. Captured enemies were forced to perform degrading acts for Viking amusement, with crowds betting on how long victims would survive various forms of sexual torture. The saga of the Vikings mentions tournaments where prisoners were subjected to increasingly elaborate forms of sexual humiliation until they died or went insane. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts with disturbing consistency. Execution sites often show ritualized violence that goes far beyond simple killing. Bodies were mutilated in ways that suggest sexual humiliation was an integral part of the punishment process. The normalization of sexual violence as entertainment helps explain how Viking raiders could commit such systematic atrocities during their conquests. They followed cultural scripts that made sexual violence not just acceptable, but praiseworthy, turning rape and torture into performance art. The Vikings created a society where sex, power, and violence intertwined with the precision of a well-crafted weapon. Their practices were systematic methods of social control that used sexuality to reinforce power hierarchies with brutal efficiency. These weren't random acts of barbarism. They were calculated strategies that shaped medieval Europe and continue to influence our modern world through DNA, laws, and concepts of masculinity that persist today. The Viking legacy spread across continents, carrying ideas about sexuality and dominance to every corner of their expanding world. What other historical sexual practices would shock modern audiences? Let me know in the comments what civilization you would like me to explore next.